We are in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, and didn't have class last week, but 2 weeks ago when we had last class, we were in 1 Corinthians 8 looking at the discussion that Paul has concerning foods which had been offered to idols, and he draws this conclusion that for himself, if eating meat causes his brother to stumble, he would not do what? I would not eat the meat anymore. And for a long time, it seems, you go back in the 1800s and the early 1900s, a lot of commentators say, well, you know, at chapter 9, Paul breaks off on one of his famous digressions, that chapter 9 is kind of an aside and doesn't really pertain to chapter 8, and chapter 10 is just kind of a paragraph in itself. But I don't see that. What I see is that Paul continues this discussion about what we have the right to do, that we don't necessarily avail ourselves of those rights. And in fact, if we are to connect them together, you go all the way back, let me get to 1 Corinthians. We go back to chapter 8 and verse 9, and he says, but take care that this right of yours does not somehow become a stumbling block. So he's introduced this idea of rights from the original exousia. So here we have a right or the authority to do certain things. Most of the time in the King James Bible, the word is translated as authority. But he's speaking of individual rights that we have as Christians. And in that, we might put knowledge, rights, and liberty or freedom kind of all together, because that's really the discussion that is in view in all of these. The idea of if I know what my rights are, the idea of my rights themselves, and the freedom that we have. In fact, Paul is very, very liberal with the idea of freedom and liberty in Christ. He addresses it here in 1 Corinthians, he addresses it in Romans, he addresses it in Galatians, and so many of his writings he deals with the idea of freedom. And so it comes as kind of a natural progression from chapter 8. If he's dealing with these rights, do not let them become a stumbling block to the weak. And so he starts here in chapter 9 and verse 1, and he asks the question. In fact, he asks four rhetorical questions which are designed, asked in such a way that they should all have an affirmative answer. In fact, it's not like the first one is a no, and the second one's a yes, and the third one's assumed no. They're all asked in such a way that the assumption would be yes. And because of the second question, when he asked here in verse 1, am I not an apostle? We've had a lot of people say, well, here Paul is defending his apostolic authority, his apostleship. He's setting forth the idea that he is an apostle to them. But he's really not. He's not defending his apostleship. He is based upon his apostleship and the fact that they understand that he is an apostle. He is defending his rights as an apostle, as a representative of the gospel. And so it flows with chapter 8, and it goes into chapter 10, where he draws the full conclusion: all things are lawful unto me, but not all things are expedient, which is the same part of this argument. So in chapter 1, the argument was, in chapter 8, the argument was, yes, technically you have a right to eat meat or food that has been offered to an idol, but don't use that right as a stumbling, if it's going to be a stumbling block. Be like me in that if I know that eating that meat is going to be a stumbling block, I'm not going to eat any meat anymore. And to show that, he uses himself as an example of having rights to certain things and not availing himself of those rights. Now, specifically in chapter 9, he deals with paying the preacher, is what a lot of people say. You know, this is all about paying the preacher. But again, if you look at the entire discussion, he repeats something over and over, and it's the idea of eating. Don't muzzle the ox that treads out the corn. It's about eating, his ability to eat. The thresher threshes. in hopes of partaking of the grain, eating. The plowman plows in hopes that he'll eventually get to eat the product of his labor. And so this common thread from chapter 8 to chapter 9 continues to be the food. The food. The eating of the meat to idols. So it's not a completely different idea. It's not a defense of his apostleship. It's a defense of his right, and specifically his right to not avail himself of what they can offer. And so Paul, he reminds them that he has refused them of their support. He says, am I not free? Well, of course you're free, Paul. Free to eat the meat? Yes, of course, Paul, you're free to eat the meat. But that doesn't mean you have to. Am I not an apostle? Have I not seen the Lord, or Jesus our Lord? Are not you my workmanship in the Lord? Yes to all of these. They knew that Paul had come to Corinth and taught them. They knew that he was an apostle. They knew that he had freedoms in Christ. They knew these things. He even says, if to others I am not an apostle, at least I am to you. For you are the seal of my apostleship in the Lord. This is my defense to which those who would examine me, do we not have the right to eat and drink? So he's not defending his apostleship. He's dealing with his rights to eat and drink. And he says, do we not have the right to eat and drink? Do we not have the right to take along a believing wife, as do other apostles and the brothers of the Lord and Cephas? Or is it only Barnabas and I who have no right to refrain from working for a living? Now, if we keep chapter 9 in the overall context of Corinth, and remember the vying for power and the patronage, if I supported you, then you would have an obligation to me. And Paul says what to the Corinthians? I'm not going to take your support. I have a right to, but I'm not going to take it. I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that Paul sees how they are vying for the power and the status and the patronage, and knows how they would expect someone that they have supported financially to be in obligation to them. Paul says, I'm not going to be in obligation to you. I'm in obligation to only one, which was who? God. Paul was going to receive his reward. He comes to that conclusion in 17 and 18. He's going to receive a reward, but it's not going to be from men. It's going to be from God. So he is dealing with this rights and privileges that they have, and he refused their support. But the ultimate idea is that it gets down to in verses 19 and following. I may have the right to certain things, but I refuse that right at times. Why? I became all things to all men that I what? Might win the more. So Paul says, I'm going to forego certain rights if I have to in order to win more people. And of course, winning means saving. Win the more, and then he says, there in verse 22, I've become all things to all people that I might, by all means, I might save some. He's winning them, he's saving them. And so all things are lawful, but not all things are expedient. It's not always the best idea. So Paul continues the discussion on rights and authority. Having the right to eat idol foods doesn't mean that we should. Having the right to live by the gospel doesn't mean that we have to. Having the right to live my way doesn't mean that I can't change the way I live in order to win other people to Christ. James?
It comes down to how we treat each other.
Absolutely.
They were, those people, I think they kind of was condescension on those who consciously could not say. And those who they had the knowledge to know that, well, we can eat it, so they should
Yes.
hold the love for each other.
Absolutely.
Knowledge over love.
Yes, and that's that, and he brings that out clearly in verse 8, and he's going with that same idea of just because I have the knowledge of something. Remember, I think a couple weeks ago I made the statement that knowledge without love can be abusive, and he's trying to curtail that. Let's not get into that abuse. Let's consider one another.
There were people there that lived it, they could just consciously, they did.
Yeah. And so they're growing and getting to that point. But even to those, and he seems to really be addressing those who consider themselves the knowledgeable. We're the knowing ones versus the weak ones. We're the knowing ones. And he seems to be addressing those knowing ones, saying, just because you have that right doesn't mean you need to exercise that right. In our society, rights are something that we're going to hold to tenaciously, and we may not even want to do something, but I have a right to do it, and so I'm going to do it. And Paul's saying, have deference toward your fellow Christian. Have deference toward your fellow man. If in seizing these rights and using those rights, you alienate people from the gospel, give up the right. Make that sacrifice. He continues, he says, the rhetorical question, are Barnabas and I the only ones that have no right to refrain from working for a living? That lifestyle of the servitude, the working with his hands, was beneath many of these knowledgeable people as they looked at it. And so they're criticizing him for his right to refuse. So he says, who serves as a soldier at his own expense? Who plants a vineyard without eating of any of its fruits? Who tends a flock without getting some of the milk? So he's dealing with reaping rewards. We often refer to it as paying the preacher or a servant is worthy of his hire and so forth. Look at the example he gives in verse 7. There's three examples. There's the soldier, the farmer, and the shepherd, right? And all three of them work with the anticipation of getting rewards for their labor. The soldier doesn't, pay his own way, buy his own uniform to fight in the cause, unless, of course, he feels that the cause is justified. But most soldiers are employed of the ones they're defending. The farmer. The farmer doesn't tend the crop and plow it and tend it and make sure that it grows and just give all the crop away. Now, he may sell the crop, or he may be a sharecropper and give the rent back to the one that he's leasing from. But does he not reap benefits from the field himself? The one who has the flock, does he not at least get some milk from the flock, even if the bulk of it is going to the dairy or it's going to the neighbor or to the market? Does he not also get these? And it's a rhetorical question. Of course they do. Do I say these things on human authority? And there's that, do I say these things just because of my human rights that I'm saying these? Does not the law say the same thing? And then he goes back to Deuteronomy 24 and verse 5, and he quotes, "For it is written in the law, you shall not muzzle an ox when it treads out the grain." Is it that God is concerned for the oxen? Is that why God says that? Because he has great concern for the ox? No, it's for our benefit. Does he not speak entirely for our sake? It was written for our sake, because the plowman should plow in hope, and the thresher thresh in hope of sharing in the crop. If we have sown spiritual things among you, is it too much if we reap material things from you? If others share this rightful claim on you, do not even, or we even more. Nevertheless, we have not made use of this right, but we endure anything rather than put an obstacle in the way of the gospel of Christ. And so he's saying there is a right that a preacher, an elder, anyone who is serving the church in any way, there's a right for them to receive support for their labors. And he has used the old law. He has used the thresher and the plowman. He uses in verse 13 and 14 the commandment of Jesus himself. In the same way the Lord commanded, verse 14, that those who proclaim the gospel should get their living by the gospel. Soldiers, farmers, shepherds, threshers, plowmen, the Lord, those who serve in the temple, those who serve at the altar, all of them. And it's just the argument. He's building upon this right. And then it's not just that he's trying to prove that it's okay to do this. What he's doing is he's heightening, he's raising that bar and showing how much it is a right of the gospel preacher to receive his just reward. And once he shows how valuable it is, then he comes in and he says, what? But I don't take it. I don't avail myself of that right. To show that this truly is a great sacrifice. Remember, that's what Paul is trying to get them to do. Be imitators of me, he'll say in chapter 11. As I'm an imitator of Christ. He builds it up so high to show that whenever he refuses, it is a sacrifice. And if he, their apostle, verse 1 and 2, is willing to take that sacrifice, how much more should they, who have reaped the benefits of his apostleship, be willing to not eat meat for the sake of their brother? Sacrifice their right, even to eat idol foods. That's his argument all the way through this. And we use it, oftentimes, showing his support here for the paying of the preacher. And so he goes further in verse 15, I have made no use of these rights, nor am I writing these things to secure any such provision. I'm not writing these things to make you feel bad and start paying me. That's not it at all. I would rather die than have anyone deprive me of my grounds for boasting. Oh, Paul is a boaster. Paul is glorying. But Paul's not boasting in the fact that he is so altruistic as to not charge for the preaching of the gospel. Paul's boasting is in the fact that he has received the grace of God, and God has freed him with the same freedom that he's offering to everybody else. So my boasting is in God. He further expands that in the second letter of Corinthians in chapters 11 and 12, dealing with giving to God and the glory to God and boasting. Where our boasting is in Christ and what he's accomplished in us, not on what we've accomplished in ourselves. But he touches on it here. If I preach the gospel that gives no grounds for boasting, for necessity is laid upon me, woe to me if I preach not the gospel. Woe to me if I preach not the gospel. Why would he say such a statement? Is it because he was the apostle to the Gentiles? What's a woe? It's a sorrow. It's a pain. There's an indictment upon me if I do not preach. He was saying, I'm compelled to preach. But what is it that compelled him to preach? Yeah. In Ephesians 3 and verse 7, he says that by grace, or the grace of God has laid upon me the necessity to minister the gospel, or has appointed me as a minister of this gospel. It wasn't Paul's particular ability to preach that compelled him to preach. It wasn't that the church at Corinth was paying him that compelled him to preach. It wasn't that his father before him or his brothers were preachers that compelled him to preach. What compelled Paul to preach was the grace of God. And we look at our lives and say, well, I'm not a gospel preacher. But we sing the song, I love to tell the story. Right? Why would we love to tell the story? Well, the same reason, isn't it? Because the grace of God has laid upon us the sacrifice of Christ, the realization of my sin, the emptiness I feel without telling others of the greatness of God. Paul is saying, I love to tell the story. Woe is unto me if I preach not the gospel, because it will be pain and heartache on me, because I know what God has done. I know what little I can do. And that little is preaching the gospel. Well, does that mean today that we need to be preaching the gospel? Okay. Yeah. You know, not all preaching takes place right there on that stage behind that pulpit. There's more preaching that happens Monday through Saturday at your desk and in your truck or your classroom. That's a good point. Jane, if you didn't hear him, he said that the preaching up here is what should motivate us to go out and proclaim to those around us that we work with, that we come into contact with. The same gospel story, the same story that compelled Paul, that Jesus came and died so that I might be forgiven of my sins. That same story of grace and mercy falls upon us and compels us to tell it. Ephesians 4, a couple of weeks ago, we did the lesson on Ephesians 4. You know, he's given some to be apostles and some prophets and some shepherds and some teachers. And why? Why did he give those? He gave those roles in the church specifically to equip the saints. That's everybody else. That's we as a church are equipped by the roles which God has appointed in the church. And that rings true today, even now. The roles that we see in the church are there not to do for us, but to train us to do for God. Right? I mean, that's what Ephesians 4, 11 and 12 tells us. Those roles are to equip the saints. And so, yes, each of us should say like Paul, there's no grounds for boasting in my ability. Woe is unto me if I do not preach the gospel. There's no grounds for me to boast in my choice to share the gospel, for woe is unto me if I don't share it. The pain and the heartache to know that I have betrayed the grace of God. Because it's the grace, remember, he says, that appointed him to that gospel ministry. That's the grace that each one of us have received as Christians. And it's the grace that compels us to go further. Corey last week used 2 Corinthians 4, that we have this treasure in earthen vessels, these jars of clay, this human body. Well, the treasure that we have in us is that gospel. It's that message of grace. And he says, even though our gospel be veiled, it is veiled to those who will not listen, but to everybody else, it is flowing out of this earthen vessel. And it is reaching into the hearts and the minds of those around us so that they may know the freedom, they may know the grace and the mercy of God, that they may know heaven itself. Woe is unto me if I preach not the gospel. For if I do this of my own will, verse 17, I have a reward. I'll get something for it. I'll have, if I'm making the choice and it's just me, I'll take the money. But he says, that's not it. But not of my own will. That is, if I'm compelled by the grace of God, and it's his will for me that I preach, says I'm still entrusted with a stewardship. He's used this in chapter 4 and verse 1. He says, how should you consider us? He says, as stewards. Remember that? As slaves and stewards. There's a connection between the word slave and steward that, the steward is he is the managerial slave. Still slavery, still under the oversight and the auspice of the master. He's not the one who is in charge of everything. He is the one who is in charge of the house, accountable to the master. Still a slave. He says, if I'm choosing it of my own accord to preach the gospel, then I might have a reward. But even if I didn't choose it, I've still been entrusted by God with this stewardship. The word stewardship, by the way, is the Greek word where we get our word economics. The laws of the house. And as a steward of the house, the rewards, the benefits that came to the house didn't go to the slaves. It didn't go to the steward. Where did the rewards of the house go? To the master. And anything that the slaves received or anything that the stewards received didn't come from the sale of the vegetables or the produce. It came from the master. The same way today, any benefits that we as Christians reap today, they don't come from other people. They don't come from other slaves. They don't come from other stewards. They come from where? From the master. They all come from the master. And so he says, what then is my reward? That in my preaching I may present the gospel free of charge, so as not to make full use of my right in the gospel. What's my reward? The freedom I have to take this gospel of freedom into a world that is in bondage, that we might free some more. His reward, Paul says, is that I get to preach the gospel. I preach, and that is my reward. I tell others of the saving grace. And it's just, if you've ever had the opportunity to teach someone the gospel and see them baptized for the remission of their sins, there is an excitement and a joy in watching that come to fruition. And Paul says, that's my reward. And it doesn't come from my fellow slaves and stewards. It comes from the master. But he says, I'm able to preach the gospel free of charge and not make exercise of my right. Sometimes we fall into the trap of thinking that Paul is saying that it's somehow morally superior to preach without receiving an income. A friend of mine preaches in another town, and there's a fellow in the congregation there who is he's graduated from a school of preaching, and he has a secular job, and he's trying to convince everyone that it is somehow altruistic and a better circumstance, morally superior, for him to work a secular job and preach full time and not receive any money for preaching full time. But that's not what Paul's doing. Paul's not saying that I'm somehow altruistic and better than every other preacher who's ever received money for preaching. He's saying I'm making a sacrifice just in case there's any stumbling block that someone might have about paying the preacher. You know, I remember in school we'd hear about people who were, they would have a lectureship over here, and they would sell a book of the lectures. I even have one of the books in my library, one of those lectureship books. And there was a preacher who said, "Well, I'm not going to sell the gospel. I'm not going to put a price on it. If you have to pay to hear the gospel, then that's wrong. We're going to preach the gospel free of charge. That's the way it's got to be." And so he refused to submit his manuscript to the book. But what he did is he had it printed himself in a little signature. And when they sold the book, then they took the signature that he paid for himself and stuck it in his place in the book. And it's loose leaf. It's not in the binding. Because somehow he felt it was better to not sell the gospel. But those who preach for support their families, they're not morally inferior. There's nothing wrong with supporting the preaching of the gospel. And if that means you're putting it in a book form and you're buying the book, or if you're going to a seminar that's a paid fee to get in for the preaching of the gospel, there's nothing morally superior to not paying versus paying. It's all okay. Paul chose not to avail himself of the right. What's amazing is, if we say, well, it's better that Paul didn't receive money, then was it worse when in 2 Corinthians, in chapter 11, beginning in verse 7, he says, while you didn't pay me, other people did? I received, in fact, he even says, I robbed the churches of Macedonia so that I may labor among you. If it's morally superior not to take pay, was Paul then morally inferior in the 2 Corinthians letters to take pay? You see, Paul's not discussing the superiority or inferiority of receiving pay. It's not even about the pay. It's about the right. That's how it ties in with chapter 8. It's how it ties in with chapter 10. It's how it ties in with chapter 11. It's about the right. And if I have the right to receive it, I also have the right to refuse it. And it goes back to what James said. My receiving it or my refusing it is based upon my consideration for other people. And that's what Paul's saying. That's his argument here. It's about the right. So not to make full use of my right in the gospel. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 times in 18 verses that Paul makes reference to his right, his rightful claim, the rights. You know, when you see a word that's repeated that often in a context, you have to understand that's an emphasis that the writer, in this case Paul, is putting on that particular subject. It's not about defending his apostleship. It's not about whether or not a preacher should get paid. It's all about the right to receive and the right to refuse based upon concern for other people. How is this going to affect others? For though I am free from all, what was his first question? Am I not free? Yeah, Paul, you are free. Am I not an apostle? Yes, Paul, you are an apostle. Well, as an apostle, I have a right to receive this, but I don't, in deference to others. And now he's going to answer that first question. Am I free? For though I am free from all, I have made myself a servant to all. There's that relationship. He's called himself a steward, and now it's the idea of servant or slave. They're going in the same idea because they're swirling around Jesus as the master. I've made myself a servant to all that I might win more of them. To the Jews, I became as a Jew in order to win Jews. To those under the law, I became as one under the law, though not being myself under the law, that I might win those under the law. To those outside the law, I became as one outside the law, not being outside the law of God, but under the law of Christ, that I might win those outside the law. And to the weak I became weak, that I might win the weak. I have become all things to all people, that by all means I might save some. I do it all for the sake of the gospel, that I may share with them in its blessings. So here, it's following the same path, the same argument, that just because you have a right to do something doesn't mean you have to do it. You can forego those rights. He has a right to live as Paul lives. But he says, just because I have a right to live that way doesn't mean that's the way I'm always going to live. To the Jew, I became as if I were a Jew. I lived in a way that would be less offensive to them. To those who were under the law. Under what law? What were Jews? Weren't they under the law of Moses? Well, you have to understand, Jew was, kind of a twofold term. It referred to those who were born of the bloodline of Abraham, and it was also in reference to those who lived under the law. And you had some Jews that were Jews by race that were not really practicing the religion. You had some people that were not born as a Jew but practiced the religion of Judaism. We call them proselytes, living as under the law. So it's a reference to those who were Jews, zealous Jews or proselytes, Gentiles. Not just those that are not living by the law, but those who are outside the law, not under the purview of the law of Moses, Gentiles. And the weak. Remember, the knowledgeable, they're kind of hung up on that idea of weak. He's addressed it in chapter 8. He brings it back here again. And to the weak, I became as the weak. If the weak thought that I could not eat meat offered to idols, guess what I did? I didn't eat meat offered to idols. That's what he means. He's not saying to the bartender, I became a drunkard, so he better identify with me. And to the thief, I became a fellow art thief with him so that he could better identify. No, Paul's not saying that he broke the law or that he sinned against God. He's saying under the purview of the law of Christ, where I could live, if I was staying with some Jewish friends trying to convert them, I wouldn't break out pork chops and put them on the grill, right? That's all he's saying. Those things which will become offensive and stumbling blocks to doing what? To winning them. That's the goal. Winning them. Saving them. If there was something that was a stumbling block or an impetus for them, or impediment from them obeying the gospel, then I didn't do those things. And if there was something that I could do, then those things I would do.
That probably seemed inconsistent to some people, but his goal was his high standard.
Yeah.
That was his standard was consistent. Right. And to some people, that might look inconsistent in doing this over here, this over there, but it was for a higher purpose.
There are people that claim to be Christian, and they're very confrontational and in your face to anyone who is on the outs with them. And I think one of the places we see this a lot is in how people who claim to be Christians deal with, like, the issue of homosexuality. I'm not saying we need to become homosexuals in order to gain the homosexuals, but we certainly don't need to be berating them in public. What we need to be doing is teaching the truth in love. But we the ones that make the news are the ones that are abusive and berating. And what does that do? That makes Christianity look bad, and it gives them a bad taste. And so a Christian approaches them and they say, well, I don't want to be part of anything you're part of. This is how I was treated a week ago by someone who claimed to be a Christian.
This right here is telling you how smart, how intelligent Paul was. To know everybody else is right. You don't have to deal with other folks. Sometimes we can't deal with it because we don't really know what they are or what they're about.
Yeah.
But
And
he could do everything. He was flawed, man. He'd be like him, you know what I'm saying?
And to me, this falls into, you talk about knowing people and who they are and what would be offensive, and the line that he could walk, because he's still a Christian. He's still bound by the law of Christ. He even says right here that I'm under the law of Christ. That's how I walk. But the things that I'm allowed to do in order to appeal to others, To know those things, that to me is the fulfillment of Jesus saying that we are to be as wise as serpents and harmless as doves. Paul?
To understand the meaning of agapeo love, its fullness and its completeness, and to realize that applies to us as we love our neighbor as ourselves, we forego a lot of these problems like that. We can really understand that term and how we're practicing and believing it.
Absolutely. And that's all the way from chapter 8. This was about love. It's about love for those that we would consider weak. I think Paul's love for those who consider themselves the knowledgeable ones. Love for the Jew, for the Gentile, for the proselyte, for the weak, for everybody. It's all about love. And those are the things that are taken care of if we learn that self-sacrificing love. And that's what Paul is saying. Just because I can do it doesn't mean I have to do it. I can sacrifice some of my rights because I love my neighbor. Now that's not really what our society is about. If it's all right, we're going to do it. And if it, angers my neighbor, that's okay. I get my right. Well, that's not new to American culture. That's what was happening in Corinth. And Paul is saying, sometimes if you love your neighbor, that means sacrifice things that you have a right to. And so he finishes with this last paragraph. Do you not know that all in a race the runners compete, but only one receives the prize? So run that you may obtain it. Whatever the cost is, you're running a race, run in a way to win this race, which means you may have to sacrifice some self-denial. And so he uses every athlete exercises self-control in all things. They do it to receive a perishable crown, but we an imperishable one. What do these athletes do? They practice self-sacrifice and self-denial so that ultimately they can win the race. Paul says, I practice the same thing. I'm not running aimlessly. I do not box as one beating the air, but I discipline my body. I use self-control. I discipline my body to bring it under control, lest after preaching to others, I myself should be disqualified. Self-denial, a valid right that we have in Christ, is an acceptable way and necessary often to show the kind of love that we're supposed to show. Any questions or comments on further? It's a great chapter, and it's in a great context. And I think we miss the point if we emphasize, Paul's here defending his apostleship. He is here defending love between brothers and sisters and a willingness to self-sacrifice for the benefit of others. And that's something we can all do. I appreciate your attention. We'll pick up chapter